gums at each other any chance they get. The fight clock is brought to you by Modelo. One of the greatest knockouts you'll ever see. It's time
for you to sit back, relax, and listen to a complete and fucking utter armchair expert give his completely and utterly useless opinions on the one hell of an amazing sport that is MMA.
G'day guys, sorry this podcast did not drop on yesterday, on Saturday. Let's just say Friday night got a bit eventful, but of course we have the upcoming UFC 296 from Las Vegas, Nevada, the last pay-per-view of 2023. Where did the time go, man? It does not feel like it's been that long, but I may as well continue the tradition of recapping the previous card in the first segment. Of course, UFC 295 from Madison Square Garden in New York City, the world's most famous arena. Of course, Tom Aspinall had his crowning moment when he was made interim heavyweight champion, and he's had a lot to say about John Jones since. And Alex Periera brought back his mentor Glover Teixeira's belt to the same gym by winning the light heavyweight championship and becoming a two-division champion. Yeah, it was definitely a pretty entertaining card all round, pretty solid. Probably not what it would have been had Jones versus Stipe happened, because, you know, I think a lot of people, myself included, were and still are looking forward to that, and it's a shame it's probably not going to happen, at least not in the interim. But yeah, UFC 295 was pretty good all round, and now I, of course, am looking forward to UFC 296, but we shall talk about all that and more after I take this first break. UFC 296, the final pay-per-view of 2023, emanating from, of course, the home of the UFC, the T-Mobile Arena in Las Vegas, Nevada. Like I said, man, where the hell did the time go? And it is honestly an interesting card. We've got Cody, I normally don't talk about the prelims, but we've got Cody Garbrandt fighting on the prelims. Of course, you know, he's one I've always enjoyed watching. He's fighting Brian Kelleher on the prelims. Probably won't get to see that, unfortunately, but anyway, it is what it is. We then, of course, have Tony El Cucuy Ferguson. You all know he's a favourite of mine, fighting Paddy the Baddy Pimblett. God, I hope it goes well, honestly, because as we know, Tony's been on a losing streak of late. If he wins, God, I hope he retires. I really do. Like, he should honestly not still be fighting. I hope the UFC kind of, you know, intervene if he doesn't and just say, sorry, Tony, but you're done. Because, yeah, his day is done, unfortunately. He's one of those... It's really been done ever since the Justin fight, let's be honest. That was one of the saddest fights I think I've ever seen. Yeah, man, it's honestly been sad to watch. He's been on a skid ever since, really. Yeah, I do hope he retires after this fight if he wins or loses, really, to be honest. I hope he retires, but it'd be nice for him to go out on a win. But this card has two title bouts on it. Well, I suppose so did the last one, UFC 295. Alexandre Pantoja versus Brandon Royval for the flyweight, which is, I think, 135 pounds. Either 125 or 135 pounds. Could be 125 pounds, actually, because obviously Sugar Show is the bantamweight title holder. And he's fighting again in a couple of months, actually. They're fighting for the bantamweight title. And, of course, the highly anticipated fight between Leon Edwards and Colby Covington for the welterweight title. By the way, I just got done watching the press conference. Man, was that interesting. Bloody Colby doing his usual shtick, talking shit about people, bigging up Donald Trump, talking shit to everyone, actually, not just Leon. But the most tense moment was when he said Leon's dad, who has obviously passed, was in hell. And Leon chucked, I think, a bottle of water at him and looked like they were going to come to blows. John Jones and DC style, but it wasn't. Didn't happen, of course. Man, that fight's going to be interesting, honestly. That fight is going to be interesting. I got a feeling it will not be a boring one after all of that. And also, Tony was talking shit to Paddy, too. I was like, man, you really should not be talking shit like that when you're on that much of a skid. And also, Paddy's not a bad fighter. But yeah, anyway, man, that is UFC 296. I'm going to be watching it this weekend, as will you all. And, of course, I'll recap it on the next podcast, which I probably should do before the new year. I might do an end-of-year one, just recapping all of this year's fights, because it's been one hell of an interesting one, honestly. But anyway, that was UFC 296, and when we come back, we're going to talk about... This is going to be a short podcast, unfortunately. It's only coming to 6 minutes now as I'm recording. When we come back, I'll talk about some upcoming cards I'm looking forward to, including the upcoming UFC 300. Again, for the fucking... I probably won't talk too much about UFC 300 because I've talked about it a lot. And also, I do want to also talk about the PFL acquiring Bellator, because I didn't get a chance to in the last podcast. But anyway, all that and more when I come back. So, we've definitely got some interesting cards coming up. January in Toronto, we've got we've got Strickland fighting Duplessis for the middleweight strap. February, we've got Volk fighting Periera for the featherweight, I think, yeah. Featherweight title, 145 pound. And there's been a hell of a lot of decent fights added to that card too. I think Bam Bam's on it. Yeah, that's definitely going to be very interesting. March, we've got Sugar Show fighting... who did I say? Who did I say he was fighting last time? I said the dude's name. Hold on. UFC 299. Cheeto Vera, that's who he's fighting. No, not Cheeto Vera. God, Marlon Vera. No, Cheeto Vera's old. What am I saying? Yeah, Marlon Vera. He's fighting Marlon Vera for the bantamweight it is, I think, yeah, title. That he won off Aljamain Sterling a couple of months ago. That's going to be interesting, of course. And then April, as I've constantly crowed about, is UFC 300. And it's getting all the more interesting as to who's going to be on it, because you would have thought John Jones would have been, all going well. You would have thought Conor would have been, but there's some talk that he might not be on it. Izzy versus Alex 3 could happen, but to be honest, Izzy's on a long break after the loss to Strickland. And also, I don't know if he'd touch Periera light heavyweight, realistically. But, yeah, it's going to be interesting to see what happens. Dana has talked about a super fight, so there's only really a couple of people that fit into that category. There's a lot of talk that GSP was going to come back, but he's denied that. Brock Lesnar, I'd love to see that, but I don't think he'd come back. Realistically, it could only be Conor, I think. I kind of hope they do have Conor on it, because, you know, they weren't able to get him for UFC 200, so it'd be good if they could put him on UFC 300. But yeah, some very interesting months coming up indeed next year. The UFC doing what they do best, putting on banger after banger. But I want to end the podcast off just briefly talking about PFL acquiring Bellator. I could have sworn it was going to be the other way around, because Bellator was definitely a much bigger name than PFL, but it's made things interesting because the PFL now have some infrastructure behind them. Presumably they'll have Scott Coker working for him, which obviously he's been in MMA organisations before. And yeah, it could be interesting. Do they become the number 2? Obviously, of course, they've got Francis Ngannou. They could be having Jake Paul. Something tells me Jake Paul was kind of behind this decision, actually, because obviously he wants to aggressively compete with the UFC and Dana White. But yeah, it could be an interesting move. It'd be interesting to see how that goes, to be honest. Do they become a number 2 and we get 2 promotions again? There's a lot of talk that MVP, Michael Venom Page, who was arguably Bellator's most famous fighter, could be coming to the UFC after the acquisition. Who knows? It'd be interesting. But yeah, anyway, guys, it could be interesting. And that was this month's and week's podcast, and UFC 296 coming up. I can't wait for it. It's going to be very interesting. But till next time, catches.